Hello and welcome to Unlimited Realities. I'm Lisa Zimmer. I'm your host today. Well, I'm your host all the time on Unlimited Realities. But today we're going live. You've got me live. And we're going to be talking to two authors today about an interesting, a fascinating subject. These two authors, Jordan Gruber and James Fadiman, wrote a book called Your Symphony of Selves. Discover and understand more of who we are. Hey, don't we all want to know that? So I love this topic, of course. It's one of my favorite areas to delve deep into. So I'm going to introduce you now to my guests, Jordan Gruber and James Fadiman, authors of Your Symphony of Selves, Discover and Understand More of Who We Are. And we're going to be talking about multiple selves and what that means. So without further ado, welcome, Jordan and James. Thank you so much for coming on Unlimited Realities today. I'm so glad to be talking about this interesting, fascinating book you wrote.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Lisa, thank you so much for having me on, and I hate to disappoint you, but it's only me. It's not Jim as well, but I know the material pretty well, and there's a part of me that has been listening to what Jim says, so I can just move into that part at any point.
Not a problem, Jordan. I look forward to chatting. So let's just start off. What is the answer that this book? What is the question that this book answers? I mean, where are we going with this question of Symphony of Selves?
Well, the question is, why are we so often inconsistent in our day-to-day lives? And why are the people we know also inconsistent in their day-to-day lives? And so what we're offering is that the obvious, simple answer is that, in effect, we move into different centers of consciousness and behavior and thought and neurology and physiology. If you think about a sort of a system science model, there are different network attractors. Well, most of us at any given time are in one of 6, 7, 10 different selves that we usually present ourselves and feel ourselves are. We're not just presenting, we do, sure, in effect, become different aspects or parts of who we are. And what we're saying in our book is that this idea, which is an old idea, because William James, the father of American psychology, thought people were just like this, and he talked in detail about social selves. So what we're just saying, it's not a new idea, but it's an obvious idea that if you actually realize that, if you learn how to move yourself to shift consciously rather than being triggered or switched into some part of you that's not going to work in the situation you're in, then your life works a lot better.
Right. Now, that's great. I'm glad you brought this up. This was an accepted, more of an accepted reality or concept prior to the 1900s. So you had Freud, you had Jung, who readily accepted this until right around that time. What happened? Like does this have any correlation with the id, the ego, and the superego that Freud psychoanalysis brought in, or did this change that? Tell us. Go ahead, I'll pipe down.
I can tell you, if you get the book and look at Chapter 6, we tell an extensive history and rewriting, really, of psychology around this subject. And what's interesting here is that Jim Fadiman, my co-author and partner, he has been a psychology professor for a long time and has a textbook out on personality that's in its 7th or 8th edition, and he's got chapters on Freud and Jung, and all of this stuff pretty much came to him as a surprise when we finally looked at it and laid it out. So, the first point to make, and there's quite a few good books on this, is that the idea of the unconscious was bubbling up for 50 or 100 years before Freud even came along. Lots of people were thinking about it. Lots of people were writing about it. Freud ended up being the dominant player and promoter, and his ideas won out. But there were many, many people thinking about it, and a great resource for this is Henri Ellenberger's book on the history of this. So
Okay.
you know, what you really had was, starting in Paris in the 1880s, you had a figure named Jean-Martin Charcot, also known as the Great Charcot, the greatest neurologist alive. Kings and princes would come to see him. Well, it turned out that Charcot had quite a set of students that came to study with him. Those included William James, the father of American psychology, Alfred Binet, who we still know for his IQ test, Pierre Genet, who we'll talk a little bit more about, and Freud.
Wow.
They all came to Paris to study with Charcot. And Freud, in fact, was so impressed with Charcot that he named his first son Jean-Martin Freud. Now, when Freud and his mentor, Breuer, published their first paper on Anna O, in that paper they thank Alfred Binet and Pierre Genet and his uncle Paul for the work they've done on multiplicity. Anna O is really about multiplicity. So Freud, in his first paper, Freud, who named his son after Jean-Martin Charcot, who was the original point of influence, certainly was open to this idea. But later on, Freud famously did something called rejecting the seduction hypothesis. This had to do with people in Vienna doing inappropriate things sexually and otherwise with each other, and what Freud said was it was all being made up, and here is my theory of id ego and superego, and I will explain this through my theory.
Okay.
So in 1905 at Harvard, there was a big conference on multiplicity featuring Pierre Genet. By 1910, Freud had won, and the whole thing had been buried, and no one's ever heard of it really again until things like Sybil and the Three Faces of Eve came up. And parenthetically, Freud and Pierre Genet, who was Jean-Martin Charcot's great disciple and took over the big mental hospital in Paris, Freud and Genet had this huge intellectual property fight in the courts and never spoke to each other and refused to forgive each other. It got really weird and nasty. So basically, Freud, who early on said, yes, this is probably real, later changed his mind completely, and from 1910 on, the idea hasn't come up at all, except in the case of serious psychopathology and these, novels we've all heard of, and then the movies, and then the way Hollywood does it. So that's kind of what happened. There were a lot of people, Frederick Myers and William James, and William James had disciples named, students and friends named Morton Prince and Boris Sidis. And all of these folks, everybody was thinking that, sometimes people really do have multiple selves. And then the idea became what we called a meme non grata. It was never, ever brought up again in serious conversation. And then, of course, you also have most of religion agreeing, sort of one God, one soul, one self. And so we just haven't really talked about this for a long time. And then at some point, Jim was thinking about, it's blindingly obvious that we really, healthy multiplicity is the way most people are, yet no one ever talks about it. And so, now, many years later, we have this book.
Well, so you talk about when selves, when we look at our multiple selves, and they're congruent. So we learn to work within our multiple selves. Well, how is this different from mood, and how is this also, if they're incongruent, does it show up as schizophrenia? So if they're congruent, we can work with it, right? So you use David Bowie as an
let's take
example,
these questions one at a time. The mood question is a great question. And when Jim and I were working with our publicist, there was a receptionist, and she said, I'm trying to understand what you're saying. You're saying that when I kind of leave here and I change my clothes and I go pick up my daughter, I'm really in a different self? And we said, yeah, you're talking differently, you're interacting differently, you're the warm, loving mother, you're not the busy person in this firm making this happen.
Right.
And the idea is she might be at a low point, in a low mood, a low ebb and flow of energy, but she's still going to move from her work self to her loving mother and social self in the context of the other moms when she goes, picks up her kid. And so, one of the real distinguishing points of the book is that we say very clearly that selves are real, that they have their own innate value, that all attempts throughout psychological treatment of the pathological selves to sort of fuse or force them out of existence, they rarely work, and that's a bad idea. And then you have to get used to the idea that selves have their own agendas often. That's why you eat that cookie you said you just weren't going to eat. They have their own agenda, and I think they even have their own entelechy. You know, the entelechy of an acorn is to become an oak. Your different selves might not be aiming all in the same direction. So for us, selves are really real, really different, and it's only when you take yourselves for real, when you know that sometimes you move into a negative one that's bound to cause you to have the same fight you've had many times, or you're in the one that means you're not really going to get done everything you told the bigger you that you would get done. You know, you have to realize that yourselves don't always do what you want and aren't always, with you. And so that's really the point of the book. We say that the healthiest and most successful people alive have already learned to work with themselves and to do it without even thinking about it. And so that's why we give pictures of people like David Bowie, and we talk about how he moved into different personalities so he could perform, or Sasha Fierce and Beyonce, or even Herschel Walker, who was just at the Republican National Convention. He wrote a whole book about how he's, his dissociative identity disorder. But when you read the book, you see that Herschel sort of did. He acted out, and he did a couple of crazy things after he retired, and he was unhappy. But it's the key point is that having selves doesn't make you mentally ill. The way our entire psychological system is defined right now, if you say you have more than one self, then you're mentally ill. And we're saying it's the exact opposite. It's when you realize that you have selves, that you can create new selves, that you could call on happy, positive selves that you formed when you were a kid. You can do this, and back to that system science model, when it settles in and you're in that attractive basin and you fully move into that self, lots of things are different. Your thoughts are different. Your physical body posture is different. Your neurology is different. I mean, there's some fun stories in the book about people who in different selves, were allergic to things or had hives or not, and glasses prescriptions change. But we don't like to focus on the sensational because Hollywood does enough of that already when you look at the movies they go with us. So I went from mood to talking about, we don't like to use labels too much and focus too much on schizophrenia or bipolar or whatever someone's going on. We do in the book distinguish very carefully between schizophrenia and what we're talking about here. And, what we say is that if somebody has a self that needs help, and that might fit into one of these other labels, and by all means, that part of them should get help. But again, it's the fact that you have selves in the first place is not at all, doesn't make you mentally ill. It's actually the key to a lot more freedom and health and happiness.
And in these selves, you're saying we all have multiple selves. In these selves, would you also say there's variances in ourselves? So would you say that maybe Sally might have 3 multiple selves, but Johnny has 14 multiple selves? I mean, is it's feasible?
So, when you try to reify things and you try to pin them down like this, they get very weird. In my men's group, I brought a bunch of index cards and kind of everybody played along with me, and I said, really think about all the different selves you had. And we ran out of index cards. People were coming up with 30, 40 different parts of who they were, parts who they actively engage in and love. And when they think about it, that's really like its own separate thing. But, generally in the book, we don't give any numbers. And for some people, it's useful to try to map out their constellation of selves in real time, although that will change depending on how you do it and when you do it. So it's more an awareness, for me personally, that there are several major patterns of, again, behavior and intentionality and thought and internal physiology that I go through. And when I know that I'm moving into one of them and it's going to be the one that, doesn't work out for what I want, the more I work with this, the easier it is for me to be able to shift consciously. And that's why in the book we spend a couple of chapters putting together all of the metaphors and nearly all of the processes that people have come up for working with this, because again, it's not a new idea. It's in Gene Houston, it's in Gurdjieff, it's in Sri Aurobindo, it's in voice dialogue, it's in internal family systems, it's in psychosynthesis, it's in Gestalt, it's in a lot of modern coaching work. A lot of modern coaching is called parts work, and the reason parts work, is so effective is because that's how we're actually built. So, and stop me if I'm rambling on too much, but one of the examples we give is that Alcoholics Anonymous is incredibly effective and may be the most effective form of treating people with serious alcohol addictions. The first thing you do